Welcome to Girl Choose Yourself, where we're trading self-doubt for self-trust and settling for soaring. I'm Emer Zone, your host, and together we're building the confidence to create lives so deliciously bold that they scare us a little, but in the best possible way. Because life's too precious to stay cozy in our comfort zones. It's time to choose ourselves for lives that are fabulous and soulfully fulfilling. So let's go. Today I am talking with Stefanie O'Connell, who is an award-winning journalist and an author of the upcoming book, The Ambition Penalty, which comes out on May 19th, and it's available to pre-order now if you're listening to this before May 19th. So if you've ever felt as a woman that you are doing everything right, you're speaking up, you're asking for more, you're taking charge, but you still keep hitting those invisible walls and blaming yourself for them, well, this conversation is going to be a revelation for you. It's going to make things make sense. Welcome, Stefanie. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Well, thank you for having me on. This is such an important conversation, especially in the context of right now. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. The right now. Well, let's jump in with the introduction to your work, the introduction to this book. And you open the introduction with the message, you're not too ambitious. Why did you need to lead with that message?
So it comes up in the data that most women identify as ambitious, but they do not want to be publicly identified that way. Mm-hmm. So when you have a disconnect between what you privately feel and what you are allowed to express or what you feel you're allowed to express, there's a lot of tension. And that tension is not there by accident. It is there because of a culture that says ambition is a quality to be celebrated, supported, and rewarded when expressed by men. But it is a double standard that falls along gendered lines and often punishes women for the very same ambitions that are supported and championed in men. So even when we change the pronoun that comes before the word ambitious, he's ambitious, right? It implies what a go-getter. That's the guy we want on our team. Change it to she's ambitious. Immediately, most women know what I'm talking about. You're going to be judged. You're going to be seen as too aggressive. You're going to be seen as not a team player, not the right fit, selfish, out for yourself. And I argue, using a lot of data in this book, that this kind of gender double standard really sits at the heart of modern day gender inequality, even as more explicit forms of exclusion and sexism has fallen away. These unspoken double standards recreate the same outcomes.
And take us back now to the girl boss era. That was so heavily sold and people bought into it and they went with it. What were women promised there and what actually happened when they followed that advice?
Well, I just want to say I bought into it too. You know, no fault for anybody who thought, okay, if I just follow this playbook, if I just speak up, if I just harness my confidence, if I am just unapologetic about my ambition, it's been working for dudes. Why shouldn't it work for me too? So that is a promise that we were sold. The problem is it did not account for these gender double standards and dynamics that I just spoke about. And because of that, what we got was a lot of having this constant cycle of harnessing our ambition, speaking up, asking for more, and then not getting the same outcomes as our male peers, but then being conditioned not to think what's going on with this system where the same input is creating different outputs across identity, but instead we were already conditioned to blame ourselves. And we got caught up in this loop of, well, I must have not asked the right way or at the right time, or it must have been what I was wearing or how I was power posing or not power posing. And so, in a lot of ways, the empowerment, quote unquote, sold by the girl boss wound up actually being very self defeating because it conditioned us into blaming ourselves for what was, in fact, a structural problem.
So, so key. I love how clearly and succinctly that you are kind of isolating that and elevating that, because a lot of the stories and the data in the book, that really jumped out to me was this difference in response and outcome when a woman did exactly the same thing as a man did. And one of the strongest examples that really almost like grabbed me by the throat was about this advice that we've heard for so long. It's like, just ask for more and negotiate when you're in that. I'm talking now specifically about the job offer situation. You've done all the hard work. You've finally got the offer. They've made the money offer. And then you're, going, I need to ask for more. I need to ask for my worth. And then something very different happens for women than for men. Can you tell us about that in particularly, how it's a penalty for women very often, and it kind of shocks us because we think we're doing the right thing?
The worst thing that I heard was, the worst they can say is no. And that is not true. The worst they can do is demean you, gaslight you, exclude you, withdraw your job offer, say you're too difficult, say you're too money motivated. These are things that happened to the women I interviewed. Now, I want to caveat this by saying I am not advising women not to negotiate. What I am advising us to do is understand that just because we negotiate doesn't mean we're going to get the same rewards and opportunities. Negotiation is still necessary. However, it is not going to solve for gender inequality or any inequality. Of course, a lot of the dynamics I'm talking about here, of course, intersect with other intersections of identity across race and class. And those are some of the things I dig into in the book as well. But the point being that we cannot continue to buy into these false beliefs like the worst they can say is no, because what it does is leave us unprepared when we do get that kind of backlash. And then what struck me when I interviewed women was not only that they blamed themselves, but because they were sold this false bill of goods that never happens, they really internalized it as a fundamental character flaw. They thought it said something about what they were worthy of instead of a flaw in a system that rewards and penalizes people differently based on their identities. And that had long-term consequences. And so one of the things that I hope people take away from this book is that it's not just important to myth bust a lot of this stuff that we've been told and update our beliefs. It's important for us to be able to build resilience and backup plans and self-worth and community to support us when backlash inevitably does arise. Because if you are an ambitious woman and you are putting that ambition into practice, backlash will arise at some point, and I want us to be better prepared for it.
And I think that's crucial, isn't it? That we're not often thinking about context. We're thinking about what's my playbook for how I ask for the raise, my playbook for how I communicate in this meeting and amongst these peers. And it never brings in this core element of your gender matters. This is not a gender neutral situation or environment. We wish it were.
Yes. And this is so funny that after I wrote this book, the more and more I've been thinking this is true for really any kind of self-help advice. Think about productivity. The whole productivity industry is these men telling you to get up at 5 a.m. and go take ice baths and whatever. It's like, yeah, I'm up at 5 a.m. too, but I'm taking care of a 2-year-old, right? You cannot take life advice from people who are not living in the same structural reality as you. It'll just make you feel like what is a structural problem is actually your personal failure. And what that does is it protects these systems of power that reproduce inequality, because we're just stuck here blaming ourselves for every time it fails us instead of blaming the system that creates these different outcomes.
And I think many of us are so hungry in a way for, give me the how to.
Of
How
course.
do I
I
do
am too.
this?
Yeah. And that was the hardest part about writing this book, because it is really hard to reckon with these things and say, you know what, I don't have a 5-step solution for you at the end of this book. However, I do think I have something a lot more powerful. And I hope that's something that people feel like they're walking away with, because the biggest feedback I get from people is, you kind of rewired my brain, the way I move through the world, the way I see and understand what I am experiencing in my day-to-day life. And that is a very powerful framework for fostering the kinds of collective and community pushback that I think is necessary to challenge these broken systems. And we can get into that later, but I just wanted to start planting that idea.
And that is very powerful, because it's really easy to feel like you're alone in this. And as you said, to internalize this personal failing, and then to isolate yourself in that environment, and the system persists when that is the way we are responding to the system.
It's exactly right. Systems of inequality depend on us being silent, not challenging them. And that is why they work so hard to isolate us. So anytime you're getting into that sense, you're getting that sense of someone is telling you it's a you problem, it's a you problem. And not only is it a you problem, but you should feel ashamed it's a you problem. You should not share that with other people. Oh, that is a red flag, red flag, red flag. Because I'm not saying we don't have these problems don't manifest differently for each of us, but they're driven by the same collective biases. So they look different and they show up differently for each of us, depending on the unique intersections of our identity and the context in which we express them. However, it's important to understand that the roadblock isn't operating at that individual level. It's operating within these shared constraints of what it means to be a quote unquote good woman or a good man versus a quote unquote good leader or good professional, and how those things unfortunately still remain in tension even in 2026.
I love the subtitle of the book too. And it's so powerful, how corporate culture tells women to step up and then pushes them down. Like, that's not just about a pay gap. That's really about betrayal. Speak to me about that tension. And
Oh, I like that you used the word betrayal. I think that's a good word. I've been using disillusionment a lot because as I mentioned, I came of age in this era of the girl boss, right? But even before that, I think for a lot of women who are now in midlife, childhood was all about girl power. It was all about this promise that the future is going to solve for what our mothers couldn't.
absolutely.
And now we are the mothers. And it is pretty shocking to see just how little our collective outcomes have moved. Gender pay gaps that are stuck in place the same as they were 20 years ago have been growing now for several years in a row. Women's representation in leadership backsliding, mothers pushed out of the labor force at record-setting rates, Black women pushed out of the labor force in the US at record-setting rates. Like, there is a real backlash happening. And so these are the outcomes of the women who did all of the right things. We stepped up as the corporate culture told us to. And what did it give us? It left us exhausted. It left us burnt out. It left us underpaid, under-rewarded. And now the arc of this book really winds up landing where I didn't know where it was going to land when I started writing it, but it lands where we are today, where this exhaustion and this burnout that we in midlife are experiencing is now being weaponized to tell women that they should just opt out of professional life entirely. And it's responding to this very real problem of a system that subjects women to disproportionate burnout. Like, that's real. That's a
Yeah.
problem. But the solution that's now on offer is, well, actually, your life will be easier if you labor in your home for free all day and a man profits off of you. Of course, that's not the way it's portrayed online. It's portrayed as baking bread and beautiful children and a fantasy of a home life without any of the labor. But it is a very effective fantasy. And I think it's one that's really enticing for those of us who have been through the reality of these failed corporate systems. So I make the case in the book that I think the home life and corporate life actually share so many of the same fundamental flaws. And the way you reshape those worlds is not by trading one for the other, but actually by challenging these male dominated systems of power and rewards in both of them.
And I think at its core is, and you obviously speak to this in the book, that the structure that we're trying to operate in as women in the corporate world was built by and for men. It was designed for them.
Correct.
You know, the 9 to 5, the in office, the somebody at home, this magical other person working for no money or just part-time to try and have a little bit of meaning, you know, is doing everything else. Mm-hmm. And I found it very interesting when COVID happened, and then suddenly, it took like a global pandemic for a male-dominated, male-favored structure of a workplace to realize that you could have flexibility, that design is not the only one that works. And in fact, maybe another design might work just as well, actually better. And that it was an opportunity to build a more inclusive workplace. And what are your thoughts on whether we took that opportunity, actually?
Oh, it's so frustrating.
That's like just the women's kind of like language, isn't it? It's so
like the
frustrating.
sigh that holds all the sighs, right? So the frustration for me is, it was such a demonstration of how what holds us back is not a lack of solutions, but a lack of will. There is absolutely ways you can address these problems if there is the will to actually implement the structures that allow you to integrate care and work more sustainably, no matter your identity, right? Flexible work is possible. Remote work is possible. Of course, that's not true in every profession, but even within professions like, let's say, healthcare, you can, nurses, for example, employ many, many women, even though those are on the job, very rigid schedules. But because the nature of the work is, 4 days on, off, and 4 days off, and you have a lot of shift changing you can do, that creates still flexibility within that system that enables women who are primary caretakers still to partake in that well-rewarded work. And so there's really just no reason that all work cannot work in these ways that allow for anybody to have a life and caregiving responsibilities outside of those workplaces. And I think COVID really helped show that. However, that being said, as much as work shifted, the distribution of labor in the home did not shift as much as people think it did. Even when both parents were working from home, even when the dad had a less lucrative job, even, basically no matter what the circumstance, it was always women's schedules that were still seen as more flexible, more easily interrupted for managing remote schooling or doing whatever needed to be done in the home. Women continued to do the vast majority of housework. Even if they were still women working in offices and the husbands were working from home, you'd still have women often managing the vast majority of the household load. And so I think it just shows us how much this interpersonal inequality really sustains the inequality outside of the home, and how much dismantling workplace inequality and political inequality, cultural inequality really depends on challenging that distribution of labor there. Now, the other thing we have seen coming out of COVID is how quickly there has been this desire to get people into offices and into non-flexible work. And it's literally just a policy of exclusion, even if we won't admit to it, because we know there is no reason for a lot of this. Again, I'm not saying this is true for every single workplace, but we have the data about how much productivity continued to stay high, often improved as these kind of traditional workplace structures were cast aside in favor of more remote friendly policies. So that if it's not a productivity or a performance driven issue, then what you're optimizing for is a metric that literally excludes women. And to optimize for that metric instead of a metric of output or performance is by definition just discrimination, plain and simple, even if we don't pretend that it is.
That's so powerful. And it's just that it's not being named like that.
Yes.
It's hard to sell.
It is hard to sell.
If you named it for what it was. And I thought it was really, your book is so powerful in many ways, but because of the way it's structured and the way it gives the data, that at the end of every chapter, you have when you hear this thing, this myth, or this discriminatory, this old trope, then say this other thing, which is the truth. And then here is the data to back it up. And then here's what's actually working. And in this area of like the definition of what the workplace could look like, you spoke to some experiments that have been done that really show that if you were optimizing for productivity, you'd be building a very different workplace. And you had Microsoft Japan, I think it was, who were doing, who trialed the 4-day week. And they were finding in 4 days, people were more productive, people were happier. And yet when we look at this idea of having people in the office, you also share data about how the hours, we don't win then anyway, because the different view. Tell us a little bit about what the data shows there about when women do show up to the office, they're working the long hours. It's just not received in the same way. It's not that, even that is not gender neutral.
It's not, right. So if you think about it in terms of, okay, this is really excluding hourly work, because more highly paid jobs are not really based on hourly work, and the gender pay gap really is concentrated in higher paying work. Gender pay gap grows in higher paying profession. Most people don't realize that, but that people are like, women should get higher paying jobs, but that's actually where the gender pay gap is the highest. And in part because of these kinds of metrics where performance is often evaluated on these arbitrary metrics, like how often your butt is in the seat in your desk in the office, as opposed to your actual performance. And again, these are jobs where performance is like a metric, like maybe sales or employee retention or some metric you can actually measure, and little to do with where you do it. But the whole idea that the metric that's being used to drive your compensation is the location or the hours it takes you to get the job done instead of your performance on the job itself is quite clearly silly. But this study was really great because they looked at men and women who spend the same amount of time on a task, and they found that women still couldn't get the same rewards as their male peers. They still weren't compensated, even if they did try to match them in terms of butt and seat, right? And so that was one piece of it. But the other piece was women would also get the task done more efficiently with the same performance and be penalized for it. So it didn't matter whether the women matched the men on the hours, and it didn't matter whether they matched them on performance. Either way, it was still gender discrimination at play. And the way it was justified was, okay, either your butt wasn't in the seat as long, or it took you so long to get this job done, so it must have been your competence that was the problem. And for men, it wasn't a competence problem that they were there so long. It was a sign of commitment. And so these kinds of examples come up in the book constantly. And really the takeaway is the idea of exposing how basically anything will be weaponized against you, because the goal isn't actually to improve company efficiency or to elevate those who are the best or to reward those who are the best. The goal is to reinforce the status quo. And the status quo is overwhelmingly one of white male power. And so in order to do that, and people don't say this explicitly, most people won't even think they believe it explicitly, but this is the result of this like lifetime of gendered conditioning that we have been raised in. And so these are the outcomes that show that. This is why I come to the data so often, is because the data actually tell us what's going on. When you consistently have the same behavior being seen as, oh, working so many long hours, that means he's so committed. She does the same thing and she's just less competent. That is just gender bias. It's the same thing. I referenced a study at the beginning of the book about how all the other different identity characteristics get weaponized against women. So they won't discriminate against women by saying, oh, we're not going to hire her because she's a woman. They'll say, oh, she's just too young. She's just too old. But for the man, it's, oh, young man, fresh insider thinking. Older man, what a mature leader, right? So you're effectively hiding what is the gender discrimination. And this is true also for metrics like racial discrimination, but through this kind of hidden language that we're all just so conditioned not to question that we kind of believe it. Like all the time, women will be like, well, they just work more hours, so it makes sense that they're paid more. And first of all, women have less free time than men. That's the other thing I read about in this book. So the whole premise that men work more hours also relies on completely discounting women's unpaid labor. So it's just incredible how much all of us, even those who might identify as feminists and progressive, and who do this work, can fall into these traps. And it's not because we're so awful. It's just the systems we have been raised in, and it takes a lot of deconditioning to get out of those.
And obviously, because there's such a concentration of men in the positions of power, authority, and influence, they are just reinforcing their own behaviors and their own biases that they're not seeing, they're not wanting to see. And you speak to this a lot in this area of, promotions and everything, and not defining the metrics. And instead, we're just, not a great fit. And
yes.
What was that term for the discrimination? Whatever it's like whatever you're not discrimination or something.
We want what you aren't discrimination, right? And as you said, you just said, reference like changing what metrics matter. This is another really good example of how discrimination hides itself. One of the studies I mentioned in the book, it's about two candidates being evaluated, a man and a woman, and it's an experimental setup, so you can manipulate the variables. And in one condition, the man has a college degree and the woman has more experience. And so in that case, what the hiring committee does is say, well, this job really requires a college degree, so the man gets hired. But when you reverse the qualifications and the woman has the college degree and the man has more experience, then all of a sudden the hiring committee says, actually, for this job, we really want experience. And so this is the way gender discrimination is still operating, while it kind of looks like we're all being held to the same standard, or we say it's not that she's a woman, it's just that she doesn't have the college degree, when in fact, really, it is just the gender discrimination. And it's so insidious because on top of all this, we have this lifetime of gaslighting us into thinking that we're the problem. So we don't even think to question it as women who are experiencing it. And so this is really my hope of this book, is for us all to just be more aware of how this is actually operating, and to really bust the myth that somehow bias and discrimination is behind us, because it is very, very much with us in shaping the inequality that has sustained itself through the last 20, 30, 40 years, even as women have been graduating from college at higher rates than men and are more ambitious than ever and are more empowered than ever. And that's really something I want us to not just sit in our disillusionment with, but to be angry about and to harness into the change that's necessary to confront these systems now.
And a very important part of your book is really kind of leaning into that in the what we can do about it, and that it isn't a woman alone on a
Yes.
personal self-improvement, fix myself plan,
Correct.
which as much as upskilling and, you know, empowering ourselves, looking after ourselves, speaking up is helpful and knowing articulate ways to do that, absent the group environment, the community, we are just going to be making this micro improvements and feeling that it's an us problem, which
Yes.
is what benefits the system.
Exactly right. And I just wanted to add again that I am in no way suggesting that whatever work we are doing for ourselves is not important. I am saying that I think we have reached the limits of the effectiveness of what if that's going to move the needle anymore in terms of our macro outcomes, right? And so for all the work we are doing, yes, let's continue doing that work on ourselves, but also for every piece of it, let's add a community element into it. Let's add a collective element into it. So if I want to advance in my workplace, it's not just about me upskilling and knowing how to advocate for myself. It's knowing that I have to share resources and institutional knowledge with my coworkers and my peers, and to build systems of accountability and advocate for those systems within my workplace, like pay transparency policies, or if there are policies of equity and inclusion, making sure they're actually being enforced if you have, of course, the safety and ability to do so. But again, that's where that community element really comes in, because in order to enact a lot of this kind of pushback we're talking about, you need to build resilience, and you cannot build resilience alone. You need to do it in community with others. And that's the other thing, you know, when you're in a negotiation just one-on-one, it's just you, right? But if you're coming at it together, if you're coming at it through, this isn't just about me and my pay. This is about creating a more equitable system of work and rewards that benefit all of us, benefit the company, benefit efficiency, right? All of this bias is costing companies a fortune, right? They are elevating these mediocre underperformers at the expense of the people who are being more efficient and getting better outcomes in less time. And so it really is in everybody's interest to work together to make these systems operate more equitably.
And on that note, I wrote like loads of notes when I was reading your book, because I was like just capturing it all. And I had a pre-copy, so I didn't have, normally I'm a hard copy, sort of write in it. I can never resell my books, but I was like writing lots of notes. And speaking about that community element, I was like highlighting some of the data that you had on that, just about collective power. And you were talking about union membership and saying over the course of a career, the cumulative impact of a union membership is associated with an estimated $1.3 million average increase in lifetime earning.
Yes.
And that was just one example of what community can do.
Yeah. So unions increase everybody's wages and reduce gender pay gaps and racial pay gaps, right? Great example of a net win for everybody. And even if you are not in a profession or a workplace where a union is accessible to you, the lesson of unions is collective action, right? And so what can we learn about working together, learn about, harnessing the power of the many instead of the individual? And that's a huge theme throughout this book, right? Always recontextualizing our own individual experiences within the context of how is what I am experiencing happening beyond me, and how can I understand it within these systems of power? Because it's really, really hard if you're just thinking about these things on a one-to-one level. You can justify anything on a one-off, right? Yeah. Household inequality is a very good example of this, right? Relationships are give and take, sure. Any scenario individually, you can say it makes sense. What doesn't make sense is when it is constantly weighted in a direction that favors men and takes from women, right? And so this is true with all of the data in the book. Once you contextualize your experience within the broader experience of what is happening to everybody within these systems, that is empowering, right? When people are like, oh, if it's not me, it's the system, what can I do? There's this sense that is admitting victimhood or admitting defeat. But we know in the research that the most effective ways of combating these things is not at the individual level. It is at the community level. It is understanding these broader power dynamics. So I want everyone to really take this time to try to reframe this as understanding what we thought of as empowerment is actually being the thing that's disempowering us, because that's the thing that's keeping us stuck in this loop of impossible no-win situations and catch-22s. And it's recognizing that challenging the system of power that keeps penalizing us no matter what we do is something that really does produce change, and we can find and reclaim our actual power by challenging these systems.
And that element of community, I just think is so important. And you spoke about it as well, the community of women together, and that improves outcomes for women getting leadership roles, for getting raises when they're in community and they're advocating as part of a group and they have that group to lean into. I think many women, I'm Gen X, and I grew up with the, you can be anything, and then going into the workplace and saying, there are a few sort of, caveats to that.
Yes.
But something that I found that I really related to in particular was this argument that you would hear that, there is no discrimination. It's a meritocracy. Look at, I don't know, Mary Smith up there in our top leadership. This sort of tokenism, and then anyone can do it if Mary Smith can do it.
Yes.
And I sort of fell over when I looked at your data, looking at this sort of tokenism, and that what happens to women's prospects of reaching high leadership in these companies where they have just one woman at the highest level. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I'm sure many people will feel it in their bones.
Yeah, I think the data point was that once a woman gets hired into a position of senior leadership, the chances of a second woman getting hired drops by about 50%.
That's what I remember.
That's right. Yeah, that's it. I mean, yes. So what it's shocking. It's shocking, right? So what happens is a company will give, and I won't say give, because women are qualified for these positions. They are overqualified, frankly, and underrepresented in these positions. But they will finally give a woman the reward she is due and being elevated into a position. And then they will say, I'm just going to check that box off the list. We've got a woman in a position of power. We have taken care of it. And nothing about the culture of the company that excludes women from advancing in the first place changes. And then the woman who's been elevated really doesn't have the power to change much either in the culture. And she can be effectively sidelined because she does not have enough women or enough people who are true allies represented in those positions of power to fundamentally change the culture. She can sit at the table, but if she's saying, we really need a paid leave policy here, and every man there is saying, why? I've got a stay-at-home wife. I don't see the need. Then it doesn't matter how much power she has if the culture is not committed to changing. And oftentimes companies will use this kind of token woman as a cover for a culture that doesn't change. And then what becomes even more toxic is the way that woman who has been elevated can then be cast as ineffective, as not changing the culture, but for everybody else, including the other women. And then the other women can say, well, she's not our ally anyway. Look, she didn't do anything, even though as she was never really empowered to do so to begin with. Because what the data do show is that when women do become represented in leadership at scale, at a meaningful representational level, the culture does change. Pay gaps do close, promotion gaps do close. And that's the difference between having a token woman in power and having women actually represented in leadership the way in which they are represented in the world.
And there was one study that you brought up on that point. I think it was a UK study. And you shared that in that study, the wage gap eliminated when more than 60% of workplace managers were women.
Yes.
So that's the number, ladies. 60%.
60%.
In that
men
study.
will lose their minds if you say such, deem to suggest that 60% of workplace managers should be women, even though 83% of them are now, whatever it is now. Yeah. So yeah, but that's the point, right? If you get critical mass, if you get true representation, that allows for culture shift. But unfortunately, like, women are more often simply having their access to leadership restricted because of this kind of token approach. And so you don't get enough buy-in to the culture change. But those companies that do have more women in leadership, they perform better.
Yeah. So when I was looking at particularly the pay gap, we were talking about, like 60% of women in management, and then it closes. It opens up really quickly. There's 3 years from when somebody would graduate, a man, a woman, from the same university. And they did a study looking at that dynamic. And it was like the woman was only earning 75% of what the man was earning. And then that just compounds. And
yes,
speak to that a little bit, because motherhood doesn't explain this, doesn't excuse this.
Right. Yes. So one of the biggest contributors to the gender pay gap is the gender promotion gap. And this is a phenomenon called the broken rung, where women are well represented at the entry level, right? So they are overrepresented in higher ed, in college, and basically everything that makes you qualified in the workforce. And then at the entry level, you get kind of like the most equity you're ever going to see. And then from there, it quickly diverges. And people who don't believe in the pay gap, I don't know why they don't believe in the pay gap. We have the data every single year, but they'll say things like, well, if you control for the same job, the pay gap disappears. Well, not only is that not true, but controlling for the job is like saying if you control for sexism, the gender pay gap disappears, because what drives the pay gap is the fact that men are more likely to be promoted than women, even when they underperform them. They're more likely to be given the support and the mentoring to reach those next levels. They're more likely to have their contributions overestimated. Women are more likely to have their contributions underestimated, to not get credit for their work, right? And so much of what drives these disparities in pay are not just these daily microaggressions, these daily differences in access to support, or what is rewarded versus what is penalized, but also in these major steps up in the advancement process. And that advancement process, the gap opens up immediately, right? So you went from women being more qualified to being relatively equal to immediately men get ahead, first step up from entry level to manager. First step up, called the broken rung. It is the beginning of a gender gap that gets worse and worse and worse over time, and compounds over the course of a career, not just because men still remain more likely to be more rewarded and more promoted as they underperform, but the more you get ahead, the more access you also gain to benefits like flexibility, like being able to work remotely often, like paid leave, and the very things that make things like caregiving more easy to integrate into your professional life. And when you cannot advance at the same rate, not only are you not getting paid at the same rate, but then you also are not getting access to those higher level benefits. And that makes work fundamentally far less compatible with women's family lives than it is for men. Men actually have greater work-life balance than women. They have access to more flexibility than women. In the United States, men are actually 25% more likely to have access to paid leave. They are simply less likely to take it. I know that is bananas. That is bananas. And I do hope that changes. This is based on the states where these policies have been implemented, and the studies have been starting to see like, how is this being utilized? Because men have better access to these jobs where you do get paid leave, and you do in the even in the states that require paid leave, it often requires a certain amount of continuous time in the paid labor force. Well, what does it take to be able to have uninterrupted time in the paid labor force? Is not having caregiving responsibilities, right? It's such a horrible catch-22 that we largely don't even recognize, right? And so then they're the ones who are better positioned to have take the sick day if the kid needs to stay home from school, or take the leave. And then they don't, because at this point they're already far ahead. They have the power and they take it. And they outsource basically all of their labor. And I'm saying, statistically speaking, this is not true in every situation, but the vast majority of the time, based on the data, they say, well, why should anyone else in this company who's lower than me need access to this stuff? Because I have access to it and I didn't even need it, right? And not acknowledging, of course, that the reason they don't need it is because their partner is that person lower down at another company who's being told the same thing, right? And this is the insidiousness of modern day misogyny, because it just disguises itself as this common sense kind of language, when in fact, like, what we call common sense is horribly sexist and toxic, and we just don't even recognize it as such.
And the naming is so important. And I think that's one of the many powerful things from your book, is clearly giving people language for something that they have been experiencing maybe for decades in their lives, in their working lives, and really just absorbing a lot of self-blame and kind of putting a must try harder on their personal report card, must strive more, and then maybe I might just earn my place. And another thing that you were sharing was about, from a corporate culture point of view, and this illusion of meritocracy. You see women maybe in schools and colleges where meritocracy is a little bit more obvious. It's like you get the grade, you get you move ahead. But when you go into the workforce, it's a whole different game. Being better at the job doesn't really matter. But the companies that you were saying that most believe, that are most committed to this idea that we're a meritocracy, tell me about those companies. It's kind of beware.
Yes, it's called the paradox of meritocracy. The companies that believe they are the most meritocratic are the most likely to engage in gender bias and racial biases, right? They're the ones who are most likely to have people who have the same performance, and then to give those who are women or people of color like lower salaries and lower promotion rates. And it's exactly this fallacy that they tell themselves, oh, we're colorblind, we're gender blind, the only thing that matters here is performance. If you believe that, if that is your fundamental starting place, I promise you, are incredibly biased. I think a lot of what this book is asking us to do is recognize that every single one of us have these biases within us, because it is the world we have come up in. Any of us across identity, men, women, non-binary, whoever you are, even if you're a woman, you may have internalized these things that women shouldn't be ambitious, right? And because you don't simply opt out of patriarch, you have to be aware of that conditioning and say, why, and be curious about it. Why am I having a negative response to a woman who's doing the exact same thing as her male peer? Why do I think it's, horrible when Kamala Harris laughs, and I want to go out and vote for a man who assaults women, right? It's just bananas. But this is the world we live in, and we can of course cut that. But it's just There's just so many of these double standards that, again, we don't realize that we have. And the only way that you can combat them is to always know that that is possible and influencing you. Like, that's why even me, as someone who talks about these things all the time, I depend on the assumption that I have bias, even if I don't know what it is, to make sure that I'm not implementing it. And even then,
Wow.
I might get it wrong, right? Even then, I'll probably get it wrong. And the only way to know that is to collect the information and data over time and make sure that I'm keeping myself accountable. And that's the other thing I talk about in the book, is that, like, these are processes. These are not checklists, right?
Mm.
You have to start from the assumption that you're not fair, because when you start from the assumption that you are, that's when you're the most unfair.
That's so powerful. Just kind of the awareness of there's probably bias at play here. I need
Mm-hmm.
that to be my starting point. And many of, there's a lot of resistance to some of the solutions, like what actually works, that you share as well. And one of those is like affirmative action quotas, and how
Mm-hmm.
quotas are actually really effective. And people say, oh, we're going to have to hire a less competent woman, or, some other minority. And that's not what the data shows. The data shows that the level rises for everybody as regards how qualified, how competent they are. And it just doesn't seem that companies are solving for performance, solving for, the positive outcomes that they say that they want. They are solving to maintain a system in many cases.
That's right. And it's so wild that we accept that argument. We accept the argument that quotas are inherently unfair. We say it's common sense, that it implies a trade-off of ability or performance if we're implementing a quota. That is so deeply, deeply sexist. It means that you actually believe that women are not qualified, but it's not treated that way. It's not true. When people say a quota would imply a trade-off with performance, they are basically saying, when we do not believe women are qualified. And that is just incredible, that we're not all out here like, this guy's in charge, get him out of here, this is insanity. And this
I,
is true, of course, across many other metrics of identity.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you hear from high achieving women, people who are moving up in this
Yeah.
sort of oftentimes unwelcoming and sometimes even hostile environment. And then they get into the rooms with the power players, male power players, and they're going, like, I think it's Reshma, I can't,
Yes.
who
Yes.
talks about, you guys, like you're the guys who are running this. And I think that can inspire us sometimes to say, but it is this, I think one of the most important things to take away from you, that I took away from your book, is how important context is, how important community is, how important allyship is, how it's a collective responsibility to address this, and a feeling that for so long, that we've been gaslit to kind of go, oh, we dealt with that, the male colleague who's going, I've got a female boss, what are you talking about, that we've all lived it. I'm kind of looking at the time, and I could talk to you for another hour, but we need to make the podcast episode kind of under an hour-ish. So they tell me anyway. So I want to just a couple of quick fire questions, maybe. What surprised you most? What stood out for you most in your research for this book?
I think the thing that floored me was the extent to which inequality outside the home depends on inequality within it.
Mm.
I set out to write a book about the workplace, and I did. But there's probably a quarter of this book that is dedicated to what happens inside of the home, and really connecting the dots between how that underpins so much of what we're talking about happening in our offices, in our politics, in our schools, in our communities. And I think we have treated the private and public as separate spheres, and
Mm.
that only serves to benefit these systems of power that make integrating those things uniquely unsustainable for women. And I really, really want us to challenge the way we talk about public and private as not being separated, but being incredibly well integrated and incredibly interdependent, and understanding that what we talk about when we're talking about challenging these systems isn't simply something that we have to wait around for a federal policy to address. You've read the book, so you see I break this down at this is happening in interpersonal dynamics, like I said, in private, in the home, in our families, with our children. It is happening in the institutional, in the workplace, in our schools, and it is happening at the cultural and political. So then that's where, and of course, that's not just federal, that's state, it's local, all your municipalities. So when people are thinking about, oh, what does it mean to push back against this? I know you said this is rapid fire, but here I go. But when people are thinking about pushing back against this, like, I don't want them to think that they have to sit around and wait for, the United States to pass universal health care, because I want that too, but that's not happening today, right? But I can change the way I'm showing up in my home, and I can change the way I'm building community in my workplaces. And those are things that I can undo on a daily basis that challenge those systems of power and challenge the separation of public and private.
And what gives you most hope looking at this landscape today? What gives you most hope?
I have been really inspired by the language of refusal. That is the language that I see a lot of. This language of it's not self-centering. I don't like the language of self-centering. But what I think when people say I'm going to center myself, what they're really saying is like, I'm going to center my broader community sphere, not just this boss or this man in my life, but my friends, my community, my relationships with people outside of this one mold that I have been told is success, because that mold is not success. It is statistically oppressive, and it is statistically the thing that's holding you back. It's the thing that's isolating you from community instead of connecting you to community. So I've been really inspired by seeing people build those kind of broader ties and community structures, even now in this era of like incredibly sad news every day. It's been incredible to see communities like in Minnesota rallying together, building community care resources and networks. I mean, I think just watching the way people are showing up to give each other rides and get food and protect one another in the face of like literal assaults by people who are armed and powerful. I mean, that is really inspiring. And I think it just points to the power of collective resistance.
So agree. Inspired. Last sort of quick fire. I know you said that we can't be sitting around waiting for a policy to come and save us from this. There are many things that we can be doing individually and tapping into network and community. But if you were to sort of be able to wave your magic wand and there be one policy change that you feel would make the biggest difference in this area, take a moment and kind of think, well, you probably have a million things on your wish list, but if you could just say that one, I'd like that one.
It's so hard to isolate a single one. I do think, especially in the United States, because there is no social safety net, essentially. I was like, yeah, if I were somewhere else where that was already taken care of. But I think it has to be childcare. Yeah. I think it not just because it's about gender inequality, but because it is about collective good. It is not good for anyone to be having that much weighing on them alone. And people, even if you were a stay-at-home parent, I think you need childcare. I remember when I was home with my daughter, I basically I've threadbare childcare for the first year of my daughter's life. And I remember the first time I had to go to a doctor's appointment after she was born and having this revelation of like, oh my gosh, I need childcare. It's like I'm like, I'm home, but I still need it. And so like the idea, again, this hyper individualistic idea that only you or only the nuclear family is the model for getting things right, I think is just killing us. It's isolating us. It's exhausting us. It's burning us out. We need collective models. And I don't think that's just important for us. I think it's important for the next generation. And I think childcare is literally a model of community care, right? It's saying that's, I think public education is a great example of this too, right? We know we did know that public education is important and valuable. And it's a site, schools are a site of communities. They're not just a site of learning. They bring people together, right? And so if you can start that process at a period where women are most vulnerable to so much, not just in their careers, but in their homes, to their economic situations, I think it's life-changing. I think it's world-changing. And that's what I want to see.
Beautiful. I agree with you 100%. I ask every guest the same question as we sort of conclude our time together, which is based on the theme of the podcast and women sort of choosing themselves, and just wondering what that means for you, this idea of choosing yourself, whether it's in your personal life, professionally, just whatever that evokes for you, if you'd like to share.
I think I am someone who is constantly reevaluating what I want and being willing to completely change my life as that changes. And for me, that willingness to always be to change what I want is choosing myself. I think a lot of times we can get stuck in this idea of, I said I wanted this, and if I don't want it anymore, I'm a failure. Or if I'm pivoting, then I've given up, or I have to follow through. I'm not that person. I am someone who lives very seasonally, very moment to moment. And for me, that adaptability and flexibility with myself and what's right is choosing myself.
I love that. It sounds incredibly nurturing as well. Thank you.
It has its challenges too.
Your book is an important piece of work. I urge everybody who's listening to go out. It's on pre-order now. I pre-ordered it before I even reached out to Stefanie. I had pre-ordered it, and then I was very lucky to get a preview copy to be able to read it. And it is incredibly powerful read. And you're going to read it and kind of feel a sense of both relief and an energized sense that there is so much that we can do. There is so much hope. There is so much possibility. And, it's not an us problem. Yeah. So tell everybody where they can find you, where they can pick up a copy of the book, and where is best to kind of follow you from the point of view of getting your newsletter, or just share that with us.
So the book is The Ambition Penalty: How Corporate Culture Tells Women to Step Up and Then Pushes Them Down. Wherever you get your books, you can pre-order it. At your local bookstore is wonderful if you want to support them. Bookshop.org is another online resource where you can put in your information, and then it'll effectively order it from a local bookstore. Again, pre-ordering is very valuable. It signals that there's demand for the book so that people will stock it when it does come out. Of course, the big retailers will be carrying the book, and you can pre-order there as well. There's going to be an audiobook. Anyone who likes audiobooks, you can pre-order that too. And then I have a newsletter called Too Ambitious on Substack. So it's just tooambitious.substack.com. And I'm most active on Instagram, where I talk a lot about some of the more specific studies and data that we alluded to here in this podcast, and obviously are in the book, but constantly thinking about, okay, how is this playing out now as we're moving forward into this next step? So I hope the book is a great foundation for people, but you can continue following along on Instagram. My handle is Stefanie O'Connell.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Stefanie. And I'll drop all of those links in the show notes so that everybody can order it. And I particularly love that the idea of, is it bookshop.org? Where people can, bypass the tech bro guys and go straight to their local bookstore. It's all part of that community support as well. Thank you so much for the incredible work that you do, Stefanie, and for being so generous with your time today. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for tuning into the episode this week. I hope you got a lot out of it, and if you did, please share it with somebody who you feel would benefit. And leave a review. Always greatly appreciated. Lots of free and paid resources to take things a step further. You can find those in the show notes. And hey, if nobody has told you this yet today, you are amazing, and the world is a far more beautiful place because you're here with us all. Stay cool. Bye.